Well, speaking of Jung in Palmer's Freud and Jung on Religion, the investigation of Jung begins on page 85. And from page 85 to page 123, you have a pretty in-depth discussion of the differences between Freud and Jung theoretically, a discussion of much of what I covered in my introductory lectures to Jung for you, and a concentration on Jung's specific ideas about the collective unconscious, and the collective unconscious being constructed with archetypes, and what exactly an archetype is and what an archetype is not. So all of these aspects of Jung's theory are really thoroughly explored in these 40 pages. If you don't understand Jungian archetypes, I would say really concentrate on pages 114 to 123. These are really going to help you to get a grasp on what Jung means by an archetype. But on 123, he begins discussing his ideas of God, the God archetype in the collective unconscious. And so we're going to take an in-depth look at the God archetype, and then we're going to look in the next chapter, chapter 9, at individuation. This is God and individuation. This is Jung's concept of what we must do to become whole, have a sense of a wholeness, a sense of self that is wholeness. And then in chapter 10, there's a critical appraisal. I also want you to notice that I've added some links to two papers that I think are very interesting, short reads Jung wrote that are not concentrated on in this book, just mentioned, but one is his writings on UFOs, the phenomenon of people seeing extraterrestrials and the idea of being kidnapped, and how this relates to belief and the need for something bigger than ourselves. And also his an answer to Job, his essay on the Old Testament story of Job and his suffering and God testing him. And these both bring great insights into Jung's position on religion and religious belief. So this is, let's turning now to page 123, God as an archetypal form. When we speak of God as an archetype, or the archetype God, what we have to keep in mind firstly is that the archetype is a form. It's a certain structure that is part of our evolutionary heritage. In other words, we all share, according to Jung, archetypes, and in particular a God archetype. And this God archetype can be found in symbols, in symbolism of our dreams. The symbols change from person to person. The symbols change from culture to culture, more than person to person. But the symbols are there. The idea of God as something infinite, something transcending, something omnipotent, omniscient, some higher transcended thing. Jung says we are born with a drive, an instinctual drive towards some sort of something bigger than us that we call God. Now, the important thing is, whatever you think of God is, this image of God you have, doesn't necessarily mean it corresponds to mine or to your family members or anyone else in your immediate community. There are commonalities, but you have to suspend your particular image of what you think God is and think more generally. Think more generally speaking. And when you do this, you'll see that the idea of God, not your specific idea of God, but the archetype of God can include your image of what you think of when you think of God, but it's also much larger than that and encompasses what everyone else in the world thinks of God, which obviously isn't the same as what you think it is. Another way of expressing the same point would be to say that the religious attitude, however it may be personally or socially realized, and irrespective of time or place, proceeds from the fact that within the deepest level of our being, there exists an archetypal form of God deeply and indelibly engraved upon our psyche. The religious disposition functions, if you will, as an internal activity of the psyche, generates any energy unique to itself, and issues forth from the collective unconscious and manifests itself in the visible, multifarious phenomenon of religion. So Jung is starting from a point that the idea of God is an instinctual part of our collective unconscious that finds expression through our particular culture, our particular environment, our particular psyche and way of being. It's also important to realize and keep in mind Jung's distinction between psychic reality and external reality. Psychic reality is as valid and, well, for Jung at least, even more valid than external reality. So an individual, if we make this distinction between the objective and the subjective, Jung's psychology is saying that ultimately the subjective is the thing that counts the most, the individual's internal reality, their psychic reality. And God is a psychic reality for mankind, Jung claims. So this brings a few questions. Does Jung's claim that the archetypal form of God exists within the human psyche constitute a proof for the objective existence of God? Does the fact that God is experienced in this fashion constitute a demonstration of the fact that there is a God to be experienced? And Jung has some specific answers for these questions. So in other words, can we infer like a genetic, keeping in mind the genetic fallacy, can we infer that because there seems to be this drive towards a belief in what we call, what Jung is calling God, does that prove the existence of God? Jung tells us repeatedly that the collective unconscious presence of the God archetype does not serve as proof that God exists in the external world. So in other words, no more than anything else can be said to exist because we have a drive for it. This is a psychic reality, and that is what should be focused on, the psychic reality of this thing that we call God. And remember again, if you are from the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, from the Hindu tradition, whatever tradition you're from, your idea of God is your idea of God within your context. And this is a bigger picture understanding of a God archetype. I think this is really indicative of what it is we study in the psychology of religion, at least in our course. And that is, we're not really discussing the actual existence of God. What we're discussing is the actual existence and implications of the phenomenon of the psychological experience of God. That's the most important thing. And in this way, we share this with William James, the pragmatist, with Carl Jung. The idea is not whether or not God exists, or this is even externally real, but is it internally real? With the phenomenon of the religious impulse in the individual is a true impulse for that individual. Starting on page 123, God as archetypal form, we find throughout this section this interesting reference to an interview between C.G. Jung and an interviewer on the BBC done in the 1950s. And the interviewer asks Jung, "Do you believe in God?" And Jung goes silent, and he looks off and he thinks, and he replies, I don't believe I know. And the interviewer presses him, so you believe in God? And Jung just speaks vaguely. And I think this leaves a question open. This is a question that people often bring up. Does Jung believe in God or doesn't he? And I think what we have here is an illustration, firstly, of the ambiguity of Carl Jung's reality. And that means, as he described in Symbols and Representations, Symbols and Reflections, rather, that there is a distinction between psychic reality and physical reality. And this isn't merely, it's all in your head. This is the idea that, in fact, the psychic reality is more important than a physical reality. Phenomenological terms, what you believe has more of an impact on your life than what actually is measurable in the external world. We use the example frequently of the elf on the shelf with the young children, and the idea that whether or not this elf is real, in the sense that it has real magical powers to affect the child's life, the child's belief in it is real, and it has implications on the child's life. And Jung said, I believe this is where Jung is at with the God archetype. He doesn't believe it, he knows it. Belief leaves a reason for doubt. He knows that there's an effect. So he's looking at the process of God. The process of God is how he's answering this. Yes, I know the process of God is real, is, if we want to say, is true. It has a definite impact on my life. So I think this is a good way to look at this. And like any master or mystic, he leaves room for you to chew on your own answers. He doesn't say yes, no answers like we'd find in maybe physics, or it's not even true today, but in more scientifically minded idea of definite cause and effect, he leaves this open. He speaks of the archetype as an archetypal form, like looking at the image of God, and as a process of the phenomenon of the creator of God. And we can have two, so the archetype manifests in two ways. Incidentally, so you can read about this, the quote from the interviews on page 125. I also want to point out on, he continues page 126 as God is a psychic phenomenon that is an immediate, direct, self-evident fact of reality for people. On page 128, right before God as an archetypal contents, there's something very interesting. And this author, Victor White, one of his commentaries on Jung, explains it very well. Whereas for Freud, God was the substitute for the human father figure that may have been absent, or may have been unreliable. But for Jung, the father, the human father, is the substitute for the God archetype. We're born, or Jung says, with this archetypal concept of this all-protecting father, and then the human father fulfills this archetype. Is the first in a string of, or should, and if they don't fill the archetype, then there's problems. But this is the idea of the archetype of the father pre-existing the father. God isn't as archetypal contents. This is page 128. Here, it's a presentation of where it is that Jung actually discusses the God archetype. And you may have heard the expression, it's going to take an eon. An eon, here we can see it's spelled A-I-O-N or A-E-O-N. It's actually ion or eon. This is the Greek word for eternity. So if someone says, oh, it takes an eon, that means it's taking an eternity, it's taking forever. And there's a text, 1951 text, about the Christian eon, and this is the symbolism of Christ, the figure of Christ. And in 1952, another text, the answer to Job. These are both seminal texts for one, I would say, the archetype of the figure and the eon, and the archetype of the process of God. And in the answer to Job, and as is pointed out here, an answer to Job, very much a continuation of the eon, is an altogether more contentious work. Here Jung uses the conflict between Job and God, or Yahweh, as a paradigm for the way in which God may be perceived. And he concludes, much to the outrage of some contemporary theologians, that God contains his own shadow side. And the shadow archetype is that dark side of all of us, those unacceptable desires and wishes and impulses that we don't want to know about ourselves, the things that Freud called are in the it, the id, the ID, the id. This is what Jung calls the shadow, and part of Jungian psychotherapy is, or analytic psychology, is to come to terms to integrate the shadow aspects of ourselves, this dark side of ourselves. And here he said that this is this answer to Job, that God has a shadow side, a dark side. Other places he writes in essays and in more extended works on the incarnation, the Trinity, the Mass, the doctrine of Mary's Assumption, discussions on the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism, and extended studies on the visions of 15th century Swiss mystic Brother Klaus and the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart of the 13th century, is much drawn into Christian mysticism, Gnosticism, G-N-O, Gnosticism, knowledge. And this is approaching the sacred texts, not literally, but symbolically, through what we called hermeneutics, interpretation. And this, again, involves a very individual, subjective experience of the text. Moving on, I have some things underlined here. This is page 129. For what we are concerned with here is the archetypal God contents with, if you like, the empirical phenomenon of religion, and not with the unanswerable questions about whether the innate human disposition to think about God implies that there is a God to think about. So this is important. Jung points out quite clearly that the existence of the archetype of God, or the experience of God, does not follow that means God exists. This is simply an archetype that we come to experience the world through, an unconscious, collective conscious archetype. We look at an important distinction from page 129, where Jung talks about the difference between a sign and a symbol. And this is really important, and it might seem tedious, or it might seem insignificant, but it really reveals something very fascinating for us to think about. And we can apply this not only to religion, but to all archetypes, all symbolic things that we encounter in life. Now, let me give this an example. So he talks about the difference between a symbol and a sign. Now, a sign is something that denotes something else. In other words, a sign of the cross literally represents the cross. That's a sign. There's no interpretation involved here. It's denotation. So sign is denotes something. If you see a stop sign, that denotes stop sign. That's it. And the concept of stopping, but a stop sign is a stop sign. It's a sign. A symbol represents something beyond itself. So a symbol is a connotation. So we have this idea between denotation and connotation. A picture of a person, a picture of a person denotes that person. A picture of, say, a priest or a clergy member connotates an entire belief system. So we have denotation and connotation, and in Jungian terms, it's sign and symbol. So a sign is the thing in itself. A symbol is something that connotes, has a connotation to something larger than that which is represented. So in these few pages, Jung is talking about the qualities of symbols, a handy definition of the term provided in psychological types. Here Jung makes three important points. Number one, a symbol must be distinguished from a sign, the latter having semiotic meaning, and that is to say, a sign designates something that is known. A symbol, on the other hand, is the best possible formulation of a relatively unknown thing. Jung gives an interesting example of this distinction. If the Christian cross is conceived as a direct designation of divine love, then the interpretation is semiotic. It becomes symbolic. When it puts the cross beyond all conceivable explanation regarding an expression of the yet unknown, the incomprehensible mysteries of God. So there we see a difference between symbol and sign. Number two, a symbol is a living thing. It's open to interpretation. It's pregnant with meaning. You'll know in psychotherapy certain words are used, and the words are pregnant. It means that there's much more being said than just one word. There's a whole story behind it. You might be in conversation with someone and they say one little thing and the word opens up a whole dimension of the situation the person's describing that you didn't consider before. And that's called a pregnancy, a pregnant word. So a symbol is pregnant. It has a multiplicity of interpretations and possibilities within it, whereas a sign is yes or no, more or less. It represents what is exactly there. The way in which St. Paul and the earlier speculative mystics speak of the cross indicates that for them it was still a living symbol which expressed the inexpressible, unsurpassable form. So this is another aspect of the difference between a sign and a symbol. Number three, it follows from this that whether something becomes a symbol or not will depend chiefly upon the attitude of those considering it, upon whether or not the individual concerned will regard the given fact not merely as such, but also as an expression for something unknown. This is the same as saying that nothing will be considered symbolic unless it is apprehended in a symbolical attitude, namely the definitive view of life, which endows events from deeper level of meaning beyond the phenomenal reality. The only attitude, therefore, which cannot think symbolically is that which lays the accent upon the purely actuality, on the sign. So Jung is describing here that we adapt a certain attitude of a hermeneutic, interpretive attitude of the symbols and meanings. And I hope that you're starting to sense or could understand when I bring up that this is very similar to dreams and the symbols we find in dreams. The idea of the manifest and the latent content in Freudian terms. The manifest content would be the sign, the thing in itself. The latent content would be the connotated symbolic nature of what the thing represents. Therefore, when we do dream interpretation, we don't take our dreams literally, we take them connotatively, we take them as symbolically. So let's turn now to chapter 9, in which understanding some of the God and the process of individuation. So you should understand that in Jungian analysis, one undergoes the process of individuation. In individuation, you can imagine it as being kind of like a working towards an integration of all the aspects of the personality. The idea in Jungian analytic psychology as a therapeutic method is that we alienate certain aspects of ourselves. We alienate things we don't want to know about ourselves. We alienate things that society deems undesirable. We alienate those biological drives that Freud was that were so important to Freud, and integrating the individual into a whole, accepting all aspects of oneself is the process of individuation. And this has been a very powerful tool in psychotherapy. Jungian psychology has been historically a very important endeavor, and it has influenced psychotherapy quite a bit. That being said, it certainly would be a psychotherapy that seems to appeal, and a psychological approach that seems to appeal primarily to intellectual type people, artists. I would say that people who are drawn to Jungian therapists are probably not rural people, probably people in major cities, like New York City has many Jungian analysts. Philadelphia has many Jungian analysts. They both have Jungian training facilities. Zurich, major cities where you find college educated, not only college educated, but professional people. It's a psychotherapy that attracts a certain clientele, certain individuals that find this useful. In contemporary times, with the rise of coaching, like this personal coaching phenomenon, and you get a lot of YouTube people who are giving coaching sessions, and they like to study Jung, but they don't. I've watched them, and I would say they don't really study Jung unless they're a Ph.D. holding certified Jungian analyst, where they've actually gone through Jungian training, which is one of the most intensive approaches to psychotherapy training you can encounter. It takes a decade to become a Jungian analyst. The people on the internet who are life coaches are not doing this kind of thing. I don't know what they're doing, but I think they're watching each other's videos and then regurgitating it, or who knows, or reading, Jung for beginners, and then basing their stuff on that. But it's become very popular with the YouTube life coach people. The new agey type folks have really, I would say, exploited Jung's theory. If you want to be serious about it and think about it, you have to do academic study on Jung, read his words, read commentary by academicians and therapists on Jung, etc. So I found Jung to be very powerful. Jung has a lot of important things to say. I draw on Jung quite a bit. However, as they point out in chapter 10, the last chapter in this book, the criticisms of Jung, it does get a little out there at times, and I'm not going to say that that's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing that he's out there, say in comparison to cognitive psychology or behaviorism, which are not out there. They're very, I think, if any criticism, they're not out there enough. They're too shallow, too simplistic, which is probably why they appeal so much to most people. Because if you're going to endeavor on something like Jung, you have to have time, you have to have money, you have to have resources. You have to have the resources and the time to luxuriate in really studying and reading Jung and meditating and contemplating. And the truth is, I don't think that most people either have or desire to do that. Most people want to you know, get on with their life. They go to work. By the time they get home in the evening, they're tired and exhausted. They want to watch, easy entertainment. They're not going to sit down and read Jung. And I think it's fair enough to say that people who do take pleasure in really digging into intellectual pursuits and into self-exploration have a certain personality type. And I think those of us, and I'm one of those people, I made a career out of investigating things, researching, thinking, reading, sharing with others. I think those of us who are interested in this are in a minority. It took me a long time, it took me many years to realize that most college students aren't interested. They simply want to get through with it, get on with it, get their piece of paper and move on to what they want to do. And that can be baffling to those of us who really live in this intellectual life, or this life of research. I'm not so sure intellectual is the key term here, but investigation, searching, I like to call it. So keeping that in mind, Jung is a representative of usually people who are college educated, professional, a lot of artists, people who have resources, people who have time to spend time with Jung. A lot of artists and literary types, film types. The whole Star Wars legacy is very Jungian oriented. Comes from someone, George Lucas, who studied Jung, studied archetypes, and made films using those ideas. So at any rate, keep that in mind, and all that critique is in chapter 10, the critique of Jung. It's putting Jung in perspective. Still, I insist, this isn't a reason to dismiss Jung. This is more of a reason to say, well, I'm learning, I'm in college, and we learn about many things, and now's my opportunity to realize that this exists, and to realize that there's value in it, even though it might not be what is going to be my main pursuit in my career as a psychologist or a psychotherapist. So at any rate, when we talk about chapter 9, God and individuation, Jung really explores, this discusses Jung's exploration of how God and self are two archetypes in the collective unconscious that are related in very intimate ways. And we can simplify this probably by saying that we project what we think our potential is, what we crave to be, what we would like to be, our potential. We project that onto the idea of God. So this idea of God, and this was expressed by Ralph Waldo Emerson as well, the idea of God becomes this representation of our ideal self. And Jung says in this way that the self, the authentic self and God, must become integrated, and we do this through individuation. In more religious terms, we strive to be more like God, or more like whomever is sacred to us, that whatever particular figure is sacred to us. And this is the process of individuation, becoming more whole. Very practical, or maybe I should say a more practical way of thinking about this is the work of the psychotherapist Fritz Perls, Gestalt psychotherapist, who talked about filling holes, becoming whole, fulfilling the Gestalt. It's very similar to Jung's work, and Perls takes a lot of his ideas from Jung, but makes them a little more accessible and less mystical, I would say. For Jung, the mystical is part of the collective unconscious. It's part of the human condition. He's ambiguous. He doesn't say things from a perspective of an external reality. He says things from a perspective of a psychic reality and an external reality that need to be come into compromise with one another, need to be integrated with each other. A great film to watch is Federico Fellini's Otto e Mezzo, 8.5. And this film was made while Fellini was undergoing a Jungian analysis. Much of the film comes from his dreams, from the exploration of psychic reality and external reality. Most people see the film for the first time and they are baffled. I remember the first time I watched the film back in the days of videotapes from Blockbuster Video, and I watched it with my close friend who's now a sociologist. And after watching it, we ended the viewing around 1 o'clock in the morning, and he left, and I was so perplexed by the film that I rewound it and watched it again. It turned into probably a decade-long study of Fellini's 8.5. And when I teach theories of personality or I teach Jung, I often use the film to teach Jung. And the film's a great way to understand Jung's ideas. When we talk about God and individuation, we can see that there's a process towards individuation. And this process is often represented in world religions. Jung discusses in one instance the idea of the Trinity in Christianity as depicting the three stages of individuation, starting with God the Father, so authority in youngest childhood, then the Son, which is adolescence and early adulthood, and then finally individuation process that not everyone achieves is the Holy Spirit. It's an integration of all three. And he uses this as an example to illustrate the individuation process. You can read about this in particular on page 156 through 159. Jung also investigates the phenomenon of UFOs and people being abducted by UFOs, seeing UFOs. I would add to this today conspiracy theories, feelings that there's anything where there's something bigger than the person threatening control over the person. And then the individual has to wrestle with that the existence of something else out there that might be nefarious, that might be threatening to the self. And Jung says this is a direct result of the loss of religion, the loss of the spiritual, that there's such a human need for the spiritual that we will find it, and we find it in our mythologies. We find it in our fanaticism, fans are fanatics, in sports teams, in celebrity culture, in tribal political endeavors, affiliation, whether we affiliate with liberal or moderate or conservative or radical or whatever it is, the far right, the far left. And so Jung says that all of this is kind of built into us, inherited into us, this desire for something that's bigger than us, that we are a part of, that helps to define us. And he's not saying this is a bad thing, but it's something that needs to be understood and recognized and integrated into the self, as an individual in relation to the group. So in other words, an individual who loses themselves to the group is not individuated. This is the person who is so patriotic that they become, as Eric Fromm would say, they become incestuous with the motherland, the fatherland. They're so patriotic that that's their identity. And it's an extreme attitude. They've lost themselves in the group. They no longer they don't have a cultivated strong sense of self. Their entire identity is expressed through the group affiliation, political affiliation, national affiliation, religious affiliation, whatever. So these are all important things that the person must come to terms with and be aware of and integrate into a whole. And this is really the process of individuation that Jung talks about. I think it's also important to realize that Jung is, in many ways, a mystic. Not that his psychology does not exclude mysticism. And this is very, very upsetting and alarming for the pure empiricists, the very scientific, the folks who want to be considered as serious scientists, like chemists and physicists, which, with the exclusion of neuroscience, most of psychology is not regarded as a real science by physicists, scientists, etc. But this is the craving, the idea that people in the field want to be affiliated with this idea of science. Keep in mind that the word science, when Jung uses it, when Freud uses it, when Marx used it, when Hegel uses it, Kierkegaard, the word science is not the same as our use of the word science today. The word science in the 19th century was scientia, the acquisition of knowledge through examination, through observation, through careful thought and organization. This is not the same as what you might think of as Bunsen burner experimental design science that we have today. As Jung would point out, and others Jungians have pointed out, the rules of psychology for a scientific psychology are so rigid that individuals in, say, experimental physics, this is theoretical physics is a very abstract, almost non-scientific endeavor. It allows for a lot of leeway in speculation, and then ultimately they have to find evidence for their argument. Theoretical physics is far more adventurous and free-thinking than most forms of scientific psychology that I've encountered. I would say in this way, theoretical physics is more like what Jung does. Speculation and adventurous fantasy, imagination. You read more about this, dealing with things that we really can't see and must come to terms with in ways that are more phenomenological. Thinking of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Schrodinger's cat, etc., in the thought experiments that are largely non-existent in experimental scientific psychology. So taking this all into consideration, we have the Jungian perspective. Very valuable, very powerful. I would say that what Jung expresses is a very complementary phenomenological approach similar to evolutionary psychology, anthropology, cultural anthropology. And to understand these psychic, collective unconscious archetypes in terms of contemporary evolutionary psychology is very complementary, as we'll see when we study evolutionary psychology.